So you gotta act like it's just you and I having a good scotch. So, where do you want to start? You want to start with your parents? So how'd your parents meet? Oh, first, cheers.
Cheers to you, all my son-in-laws, my grandchildren.
There you go.
My father heard about my mother from a cousin, an aunt, and she knew my father and she knew my mother's family. And her husband and my grandfather were brothers. So somehow she said to my father, you should go down and see Mary.
Now, was this in Lebanon or here? It was in Lebanon, right?
No, this was here. This was
Okay,
here.
yeah, that's right, because she was here in Austin, he was in Wheeling. Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So he went down to Austin and met her, and he married her a short time later and brought her up to Wheeling. And I always say this as a joke. I don't think my mother ever forgave him for that. She wasn't too happy with Wheeling, but I mean, you know, we lived there for 40 years. And finally, when my father became ill, my mother called me and said that she wasn't able to take care of him anymore. So the next morning, Nettie and I got into my station wagon and drove up to Wheeling and brought him down. And for my mother, it was coming home again.
What year was that, about 65, 66? I think the step...
Gregory was born in it would be about 65.
Okay.
65 or 66. When Nettie and I drove up there, we had an interesting experience. We stopped the last night before Wheeling, about maybe 100 miles from Wheeling, 200 miles from Wheeling. Next morning we get up, it's a Sunday. We're up early in the morning, driving about 5 o'clock in the morning, and my radiator is boiling over. And I don't know why, and it's a Sunday morning, there's nothing open anywhere. You know, so we'd stop at a gas station and we couldn't find any water. You know, we'd hope to find a can with a little bit of water to put in the radiator. So we sort of plugged along, and we got to a little town. And by then it was probably 7 or 7:30 because we wasted an hour or two just trying to go a few miles. You know, this is in eastern Ohio, out in the country. So the person we met, I don't remember, man or woman, said, "Oh, you're having radiator trouble. You need Whitey to fix it." So he said, "I'll call Whitey." So about 15 minutes later, you know, his old pickup comes, and this guy comes out, and his hair is disheveled, and he hasn't shaved. He's got a big beer belly, it's sticking out over his trousers. His shirt doesn't fit. And he said, "I'm Whitey, what's the matter?" And we told him. So he put a little water in the radiator, and he said to me, "Follow me." So he drove out in the country where he lived, and he had a little workshop there and a little repair garage. So he said, "Sit down and be comfortable." Next thing I know, he's taking my car apart. He takes the radiator out and solders the radiator, puts it back in, fills it with water, fills it with antifreeze. You know, I mean, it was a miracle.
And it lasted another 15 years, huh?
And I said to him, "Whitey, how much do I owe you?" And he said, $3. I swear, I almost fell over. $3. I mean, he worked 2 hours on this thing.
Right.
But I mean, that's the way country people are.
Sure.
I think I gave him 20 maybe. I don't know. But I mean, it shows you what happened. So then, you know, we got to Wheeling, and it was obvious that my father's mind had failed. So we were in Wheeling maybe about a week getting my mother's affairs settled, and then we brought him down here. And they stayed with us here for a month or two, and then Mother bought that house on bridle path on the
Forest
Trail,
Okay.
and then Daddy moved over there with her.
Now, did she do, because in the house that we're in, you know, originally, I guess what's the carport, you used to be able to circle a
Yeah.
car around and there was a garage back
Yeah,
there?
I think there was, but I don't believe it was being used for a garage.
Okay, so all that work
All that was done by Mr. Shropshire.
okay.
He did the basic repairs on the house to get it up. The woman who lived in there had pretty much neglected it. Not badly, but you know, it just wasn't, my mother had her ideas about kitchens and things. So Mr. Shropshire made that into like a utility room, and Mother had an extra stove back there to cook in a summer, where she could do some heavy baking and wouldn't make the whole house overly warm.
Yeah. You know, those steps outside the house had MS, you know, in a date, and I think the year was 68, if I remember correctly. So I guess she moved in the house, and some years later they had these steps put in, or you don't think it was at the same time, do you?
I don't remember exactly. I don't. Nettie might be able to tell you that. I think it says 67, doesn't it?
Something like it's
Yeah.
Give or take a year or two.
Yeah.
Now, so that pecan tree in the backyard was already there, right? Because you didn't plant that. You planted two in the front.
We didn't plant any trees in the back. The two trees in the front, I had a nephew here, Madeline's son was here from Connecticut, and we got those trees, and I asked, he was a big strong college kid, I asked Tommy to dig them in. Well, he dug around for a few minutes and he quit, you know, he didn't want to do it, so I had the trees, so I dug them in, and they weren't particularly good trees, you know, we should have bought a better quality of tree, but I mean, they were just like a shade tree. They worked out all right.
So was it that elm tree in front that's still
Yeah.
there? It was that one and the one that we took down
Yeah.
that sort of split?
And I think we put two of them in there.
Yeah. So, how did your family, tell me how your family came over. I guess your dad came over to Wheeling first.
My uncle came first,
Okay.
and he came to Wheeling, and he opened like a dry goods store, you know, selling linens and things like that. And then my father came over, and my grandparents, they, you know, on my mother's side, that family came to Austin probably earlier, but there were 7 or 8 brothers, you know, and I think Cater Joseph came first. He was like the senior member of the Joseph family.
And that's Sonny Joseph's
Grandfather.
grandfather. Okay.
Grandfather. See, and so they came over first. It must have been, you know, early in the 1900s. Early in the 1900s, because my mother was born in Austin in 1906. So they had to have come at least a few years earlier than that.
Right. Now, where did she fall in the pecking order? Was she like
She
the
was
oldest?
one.
She was the first.
She was the oldest.
Oh, okay.
She was the oldest. And my grandparents had about 5 or 6 children. And in the birth of the last one, and I think it was Mitchell, I'm not sure, I think when Mitchell was born, somehow my grandmother was injured internally. They said maybe her bladder was injured, and I don't know how it happened, you know what I'm saying? But I think she got an infection, which in those days was fatal because there weren't any antibiotics. So my grandfather, I think she wanted to go back to Lebanon and see her parents before she died, or maybe she didn't know she was going to die. So my grandfather took the whole family to Lebanon, and right after that happened, World War I broke out.
That's like 1916, 1917.
1917 around, 1917. And at that time, there was no Lebanon. Lebanon was a part of Syria at that time. And Syria was a part of the Ottoman Empire. Turkey had conquered all of Asia Minor. So Syria was a part of Turkey. Turkey was allied with Germany. So when they were there, the war broke out and the Allies blockaded Beirut, which was the only way out of Lebanon was through that port. This was way before airplanes. So they were in a small village above Beirut, and it was the only time I ever saw my mother cry. She could never tell this story without crying. And she said that they almost starved to death. There just wasn't any food. And every day my grandfather would go down into Beirut and try to trade something or sell something to try to get a little bit of food and then go back up. Now between this village and Beirut, it might have been 4 or 5 miles. It wasn't more than that. It's very close now, but in those days, which would be, 100 years ago almost,
right.
75 years ago, was probably a little bit more of a distance. But my mother always said that they almost starved to death. And then my grandmother died there. And meantime, Rose died. This was one of the children, one of my mother's sisters, and I don't know whether she was bitten by a snake or what, but she died. And then my grandfather still had about 4 children, so he married again sometime after that. The war was 2 or 3 years. Well, he married, and they were on the first ship that left Beirut after the war ended. So then they came back to Austin.
So did Mitchell live? You said
Mitchell lived, but Mitchell was killed in an auto accident with Harry Joseph, Sonny's father. They had gone down to San Antonio.
Really?
They had gone down to San Antonio, and on the way back, I don't know exactly what happened, but they had this terrible auto accident. Mitchell was killed. But Harry wasn't. I don't think he was hardly injured. I don't know how it happened, but he died. And that, my grandfather had a series of very tragic things happening. One of his children died, and then his wife died, and his son, which they say was a very handsome, beautiful child. He was about 18 or 19 when he died.
Jeez, and he lost his child in Lebanon. They got bit by a snake or whatever.
Yeah.
God, that's heartbreaking.
And that's why in that family, several of the grandchildren used the name Mitchell on their children. George, my cousin George, named the son Mitchell. Basil named the son Mitchell.
Okay.
It was named after, who would have been their uncle.
So, Sonny's father, Harry, was Mitchell's brother?
No. Sonny's father was the son of Cater Joseph. They were just cousins.
Okay.
They were just cousins. They were good friends.
Wow.
So we grew up in Wheeling, and we lived very close to the church. There was a Catholic church just a couple 100 feet away. It was called St. Alphonsus. It was a Capuchin order It was of German background. The church was built in 1850. It was a magnificent church, but it was all old German style, sort of dark, beautiful stained glass windows, big altars, a lot of wood, a lot of dark wood, and it was a very large, very successful, very dynamic parish. So my sisters and I all went to school there. We went 8 years there, and then there was a Catholic high school for boys. It was managed by the Marist brothers, a religious order of teaching brothers. And so the Catholic high school was by the Marist brothers, and then it was a Catholic high school for girls, maybe a half a block away by an order of nuns. So we went, in those days they sort of separated the boys and the girls. They figured that they would concentrate on their studies more. So this was a teaching order of brothers, and there was a very good very good education. And as I recall, we didn't pay anything. I don't think my father paid anything for my education or my sister's education. But I think the high schools would bill the parish for a certain amount of money for each child that attended the high school, the particular high school from that parish, and then the pastor would pay something for that child. And I suppose it was understood that the family would support the parish church to make up for that.
Right. So tell me about playing first base.
So,
and with the girl.
I never was much of a baseball player. And we had this little pickup team. We're playing out in this place called Tunnel Green. There was like a railroad track up above, and down below was like a bowl, like a valley. So we're playing in Tunnel Green. I'm playing first base, and I think I'm hot stuff. So I don't know where this girl came from. This little blonde-haired girl comes up and starts talking to me. So I'm looking at her and smiling. She's looking at me and smiling. And I'm looking at her and smiling. Meantime, the batter hits this lazy ball down first base line. I mean, I could have picked it up with 2 fingers. It sort of walked by me. Meantime, I'm romancing this girl. And the ball sort of trickles out into right field. Mm-hmm. And that was the end of my baseball career.
So how old were you at that time?
Oh, I don't know. I was probably about 12. I don't know.
Wow.
But I don't know if that girl did me a favor or not. I might have been in the big leagues instead
That's right.
of being
the next Lou Gehrig, right?
Yeah, I know. I mean, you know, he went to Columbia.
That's right.
I might have gone to Columbia and had done the same thing, but that was the end of it. And the sad part was I didn't know who she was, and I never saw her again after that.
She's probably, you know, a sister of one of the guys on the other team.
Yeah, I think she was sent there. It was a big scam, you know, to get through me because I was such a good baseball player.
Sure. So were you a left-handed fielder?
No, I was a right-hander. I pitched for a little while. I wasn't too bad of a pitcher, but I mean, I wasn't that good of a pitcher. These kids were good ball players in those days. You know, this was in the middle of the Depression, or toward the tail end of the Depression. I grew up in the middle of the Depression. I was born in 1929, July 16th, and the Depression happened when? In October, when the market broke.
29th.
You know, I was sort of raised, our whole family was raised right in the middle of the Depression. And I saw really hard times. Our family was fortunate. We weren't wealthy, but, you know, we had everything that we needed. You know, we had one car, and usually it was a Nash, because my dad liked a Nash dealer who was about 10 miles away. And he would go over every 2 or 3 years and trade in a Nash and get another one. And I think when my father married my mother, he told her that he would try to bring her back down to see her parents every year. And he did, as much as we could. And when we would go down there, we would go down there for maybe six to 8 weeks at a time. Mm-hmm. And the schools in the East, you know, the schools we went to were way ahead of the schools in Austin, for whatever the reason. I don't want to get into that. So when we would come down, we would go into our respective grades at St. Mary's Elementary School. And, you know, school wasn't structured like now. I mean, I don't even know if my dad filled out any papers. You know, I'd go into the 2nd grade, Mildred would go into the 3rd grade or 4th, you know, and we would just go there for the 6 or 8 weeks we would be in Austin. And I'm sure my father gave the nuns something then to take care of it. And my grandmother and mother would make great big hamburgers every day. I mean, they were delicious, you know. And my dad would drive up to the school with these couple big, you know, bags of hamburgers, and they would be for us and for my uncles and my aunts. Everybody was going to that school would have a hamburger. And I mean, they were big hamburgers, you know. We thought it was really a nice thing they did.
So the family house, I guess, was where the Four Seasons is. So that's like First Street.
Yeah, it was 207 East First Street. It was 2 blocks off of Congress Avenue. And on my grandfather's house was on, I'm going to say, the riverside of East First Street, not on the opposite side.
Okay.
Now, however, behind his house was another row of houses. I mean, the whole architecture and geography is different than it is now with the Four Seasons. There was another row of houses behind there. But on the corner of First and Congress was Becker Lumber Company. And it was a big lumber company. That was in the first block. And then in the second block where my grandfather lived were frame houses. 2-story and 1-story, nice houses, and the same thing on the other side of the street. And it was just 207. Now, from my grandfather's house, you could not see the river, but we used to, my uncles.
Was that because of the houses? Or
yeah,
just
because of the houses, and there was a
Okay.
distance, a
Sure.
little bit of a distance. But my uncles and I, we used to fish there in the river. And I mean, there were water moccasins, there were rattlesnakes. I mean, it was a wild looking place down by the river. It wasn't anything nice, it wasn't anything beautiful. Now, in the winter, when the water would be up, I can remember that some of the black Baptist churches would baptize there. They'd do it by immersion. They'd take the person who was going to be baptized and they would dunk them.
Right.
Well, in that period of time, we wouldn't be around it. Maybe we were in school, during the winter part. But in the summer, we would play down there. And the Colorado River would almost dry up. It didn't totally, but it would sort of split into 2 streams and sort of separate. And you could almost walk across it. Maybe
So,
not completely.
What's one sort of river or lake, what they call it a lake now, was just it's 2 sort of streams?
Well, I mean, up above it might have been, if the channel were deeper, it'd be 1 stream.
Right.
And then where it was shallow, it would sort of separate and then would come back together again as it went downstream. Later on, after they began to build the Four Seasons, they dammed the Colorado down below there, and they backed up all that water, and then they created Town Lake. But I mean, the Colorado, if it rained a lot, that river really came up. In I want to say 1936, it might have been 35 or 37, but I think in 1936, all of South Austin was underwater, except for maybe a little bit of Travis Heights. I mean, all of South Austin was underwater. And so the old timers who lived in Austin would never buy a house in South Austin. I mean, the people who bought a house in South Austin were the poor white people or the people who moved here and didn't know any better.
Right.
But the people who sort of grew up with the city and knew what was going on, they would never buy a house there because of that flood. And as a result of that flood, I want to say this, they prevailed upon Lyndon Johnson, who was a congressman.
Right.
And I think that was the beginning of the Highland Lakes, because it was flood and dam control. And as they would build, a dam to control that Colorado, it would back up, and then they'd have the Highland Lakes.
Right.
But before that, I mean, it's hard to. It was the same thing in Wheeling. We had the Ohio River, where right above us, 65 miles above us, was Pittsburgh. And the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers came together to form the Ohio River. And then it came down to Wheeling. Well, in the winter, when there would be a lot of snow, and then maybe you'd get a warm spell, and then a lot of rain, the Ohio River would come up, and we'd have a terrible flood in Wheeling. Terrible flood. Our house was never flooded, but I can remember as a little boy sleeping in an armchair because we had a family staying with us because they were flooded out. I mean, so, I was accustomed to seeing floods. And then I remember my grandfather telling me about, 1936 and how South Austin was.
So you guys weren't down here when Austin flooded in
No,
'36?
we were not. We would come usually in the winter when the weather was real bad in Wheeling. We'd come like in February or March, you know, it's the tail end of winter, it's a long winter, and you know, and then we would come down to Austin, you know, and as you got into Texas, you know, the sun was shining, the birds were singing,
Right.
it'd be beautiful weather. And
How long was that trip from Wheeling down here?
Well, at first it was 3 days, which would be 2 nights on the road, and we would get up the first day about 4 in the morning, and we would start out, and we would drive to maybe Columbus, Ohio, and stop there and have breakfast, and then we would drive Ohio, and then Indiana, and then Illinois, and we drive like to St. Louis and turn south and come down that way. And it, you know, in those days the roads were terrible. There were 2-lane roads, a lot of detours. You just couldn't make a lot of time. I mean, you couldn't average 50 or 60 miles an hour like nowadays. And you know, to average 60 miles an hour, you're going about 80 most of the time.
Right.
You just couldn't do that. And so we would stop the first night, like Vandalia, Illinois, or someplace like that, and we'd stop about 5 o'clock because by then my father would be tired of driving. So we'd stop and get a motel, not a hotel, because there weren't hotels. The only place there were hotels were in the largest cities. So we'd get a motel, and you know, there would be usually a restaurant there, so we'd have our dinner, and we'd go to bed early. I mean, because you were going to get up early. So the next morning, we're up again maybe at 5 o'clock, and then we'd drive again, you know, and we'd stop maybe around north of Dallas or something like that. So we didn't want to drive into Austin at 10 or 11 o'clock at night. It's too disruptive for the family.
Sure.
So then the third morning we would get up, and you know, we'd be in usually at 12, 1, 2 o'clock, something like that. And later on, when I got to be 16, you know, I would help my dad drive, and my mother even had a driver's license, and she would help him too, but she was usually in the back seat, you know, sort of keeping us civil, and you know, the cars were very small then. And you know, we would have luggage between our legs and everything else. I mean, because the trunk of the car wouldn't hold much.
Right.
The cars were small. And a couple trips we made, there were people wanted to come with us. So we'd have to bring a stranger with us, you know, and bring them all the way down. They'd have the best seat in the car.
Sure.
So, I mean, you know, we made the trips as best we could. During the war, we couldn't get enough gasoline to come. So we came on a train. That was the only way. We had to come on a train. One thing I remember about coming on a train is when we left Austin to return to Wheeling, we went from Austin to St. Louis, I had to stand almost all the way because they would give preference for seats to anyone in a serviceman's uniform. I mean, it was just, somebody came in with a uniform, somebody stood up and gave them the seat. So my sisters and I sort of switched around. There was always at least one of us standing until we got to St. Louis and there was enough seats in.
So how long was the trip from St. Louis to Austin by train? So like a day, or is it less than that? Or
No. It would be like one day to St. Louis and one day to Steubenville, Ohio. That's where the train went. Steubenville was about 20 miles north of Wheeling. So, I mean, that's the way it was. The train ride, I mean, it was crowded. I mean, it wasn't as comfortable as you'd think it was because they jammed them on there. I mean, you know, nowadays people aren't allowed to stand. Then, I mean, the aisles were full of people standing. They just stood and did the best they could because they would stand. They you know, if they needed to make the trip, they made it.
Right. So we talked about your mom's family coming over here, and your uncle on from your dad's brother came over from Lebanon. What do you think? What was sort of the idea? Or why do you think they migrated here from Lebanon?
Well, at that time, Syria was a part of the Ottoman Empire, and that's an Islamic empire. And so they weren't too good to the Christians. That's why the Lebanese people went up in the mountains of Lebanon to get away from the Muslims. And so at the time that my uncle came, I guess he came to try to have a better life. Back in Lebanon, our family was very poor. And, I mean, like most people, the wealthy people don't emigrate from any country.
Sure.
They stay there because they're in good shape.
Right.
It's the poor people that emigrate in the hope of having a better life. So my uncle came first, and then my father came. And, they just worked and just tried to improve themselves, and,
So what year did they migrate over?
I don't know for sure.
Did he ever tell you, like, roughly how long that boat ride was over?
I know he came steerage, probably in the hold of a boat, like the Titanic, how the poor people, I'm sure. But that was a nice boat. The Titanic was a phenomenal boat. The boats they came over on were probably a lot worse than that. And I know he told me this one lady was seasick all the time, and I knew her family. Later on, she married here and had a bunch of children, and I knew who they were. But he always told me that he took care of her and got her food and a little bit of water and tried to help her. And I guess she was sick for as long as that trip took, which was probably a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
I mean, you can imagine steerage for a couple of weeks. It was not a pleasant trip. And I guess he came in through Ellis Island and then into Wheeling. The people in our village went to 3 places only. I mean, when I say our village, I mean the village in Lebanon. They went to Wheeling, they went to Austin, Texas, and they went to Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I don't know why they went there. It was probably because the very first people who left that village, for whatever the reason, they went to one of these 3 places. A lot of the able-bodied men would go to Wheeling because there was work there with the steel mill and the coal mines and the pottery plants and the glass plants. So Wheeling was just as good industrially as Detroit was. So a lot of the able-bodied ones would go to Wheeling. And then some of them came to Austin, and the rest went out to Albuquerque. Now, as Claire's family, when they came, they almost all stayed in New York. None of them came to Wheeling. We didn't have anybody in Wheeling from Claire's village. And that's hard to believe, because she's from her family way back was from the 2nd largest village. And there's a lot of people, a lot more in the United States from her village than from ours.
So what was your village name?
It was Zachli.
And what was hers? Do you know?
Hers?
Yeah.
That was hers.
What was yours?
Oh, it's Rumi, R-O-U-M-E-I. They called her Rumi El Matan, which means Rumi in the mountain. That's what it meant, because it was up higher than Beirut. It was up in the mountains. And from the village, when we went over there about 6 years ago, I didn't know what it looked like, but it was a gorgeous view of the whole Mediterranean. I never saw anything like it.
So you were actually there in Rumi?
Yeah, we went there for about 3 or 4 hours. We went there and we had dinner with the family I knew. This lady had relatives in Austin, and I had met her, and she had visited us several times here. So when she knew we were coming, she made a dinner for us. And I saw a couple of my relatives from my father's family. We were only there about 3 or 4 hours, and that was it.
Wow.